I am currently on the coast of Dover, in the southeast of England. Dover is the home of the iconic White Cliffs and is the narrowest part of the English Channel that connects Britain to mainland Europe. It is for this reason that Dover has always been a focal point for people entering and leaving the country, with the English Channel being the final hurdle for many past foreign armies wanting to invade Britain. By 1944, Hitler and Nazi Germany knew that at some stage the Allies would launch a cross-channel invasion, but they were unsure of exactly when or where it would take place. Alongside their preparations for D-Day, the Allies created a deception plan to draw attention away from where the invasion would eventually land in Normandy. This story is one of the most cleverly planned illusions of World War II, deceiving Nazi Germany that an Allied invasion would be launched from the southeast coast.
Alongside preparations for D-Day took place Operation Bodyguard. Operation Bodyguard was all about deceiving the Germans as to exactly where the invasion was going to take place. Of course, the invasion was going to take place on the beaches of Normandy, but the Allies didn't want the Germans to realise this. Why was that? Well, of course, they wanted fewer troops to face when they got to the beaches. A section of the Operation Bodyguard was called Operation Fortitude, and that dealt with a specific part of the plan to deceive the Germans into thinking that the invasion was going to take place elsewhere in France, around the Calais area.
Operation Fortitude was then split into two parts. Fortitude North attempted to fool Hitler into believing the Allies would launch an attack on Norway, but Fortitude South was designed to convince the Germans that an invasion would occur northeast of Normandy in northern France at Calais. It was this plan that made Dover strategically important.
Operation Fortitude was essentially a very, very early example, I suppose, of fake news. It was an idea that the Allies would create fake or false armies that didn't actually exist, and they were going to convince the Germans that we were going to attack elsewhere. Operation Fortitude South was essentially about the creation of a wholly fictitious or fake US First Army based in the southeast of England. Now, of course, it wasn't actually there, but that's not what the Germans thought. The hope was that by Operation Fortitude South was that we'd end up with the Germans believing that the Allies had far more tanks and far more weapons, far more soldiers than we actually did have, and they would also believe as well that we would cross the English Channel and attack Calais. And we can know that this was successful to a large degree because when the Allies did attack in June 1944, the Atlantic Wall, which was the main defence system set up by the Nazis against an invasion, was most heavily defended around the Calais area. So they had bought the whole story lock, stock and barrel.
Here, on the coast of southeast England, near Dover, the Allies started to implement many methods of deception. Alongside sending radio messages about a fake army, hoping the Nazis would intercept these messages and take the bait, they had to come up with something that would be believable to the eye. The Allies knew that Nazi planes flew over Britain to take photos and collect information about the Allied preparations. So the Allies decided to turn to an instrument of illusion that was previously used in North Africa in 1942 and Italy in 1943. This illusion was in the form of inflatable tanks.
Well, the whole thing has got to be, hasn't it, that the Germans are going to believe that this invasion force was real. And so, therefore, how do you do that? Well, you have to give them some evidence to believe in. So what the Allies chose to do was that they actually designed and developed inflatable tanks. The troops would come along, they'd blow the tanks up with an air pipe, then when the tanks were up, they'd then be positioned around wherever the Allies wanted them to be. They'd be covered by camouflage, along would come the Luftwaffe. They could see what they thought were real tanks. Bob's your uncle. You've got an army ready and waiting to go, even though actually no army existed whatsoever.
I have come to Leighton in northeast London to meet Luke Russell, the owner of an event hire company. Here, I hope to gain a better understanding of inflatable technology and the mechanics behind how soldiers may have handled these decoy tanks. So although it was inflatable tanks placed along the coastlines to deceive the Nazis, how can inflatables such as bouncy castles help us to really understand this?
So bouncy castles, hot air balloons and pool floats are the most obvious inflatable objects, but the technology is far richer. But bouncy castles in itself was very similar technology to what the soldiers would have used in the 1940s.
So here we've got a rolled up and deflated bouncy castle. How can this give us an idea of what the soldiers may have faced?
Well, the inflatable decoy tanks were very compact. When the soldiers got on site, they unrolled them, unfolded them and attached a motorised van in order to inflate them.
And you say on site, is that literally done in the field?
Indeed, yeah.
And what about the material? Is this similar to today?
It is similar, but back in the 1940s, they would have used a thick plastic vinyl.
I suppose the best way of thinking about these inflatable tanks and describing them is by thinking about going to a fairground and seeing one of the bouncy castles that might be there. The tanks themselves, they'd arrive in situ and they'd all be compact and folded up, and the soldiers would have to go along and they would have to connect up the air supply, pump the air in, and then the tanks would then inflate.
Luke and his team are setting up a bouncy castle to show me just how quick this technology can be. So how long would it take a structure like this to inflate, and how easy would it have been to actually move?
Incredibly quick. We reckon approximately about 3 minutes to fully inflate a decoy tank. In terms of moving, it took around about 6 soldiers at a time, but what we do know is they had hollow undersides in order to make it more accessible for the soldiers to move it. And the most clever thing about this was that from the sky, the Nazi planes thought these were real tanks.
The guys here helpfully demonstrate how easy it is to move a reasonably sized bouncy castle, similar in size to the decoy inflatable British Sherman tanks. This footage from the 1940s shows soldiers climbing inside the tanks and then easily walking forward, a brilliant illusion from the sky.
So, you've got a fake army. But the fake army is supposed to be real. So what do you have to do? You have to convince the Germans that the fake army is real by more than just having a set of tanks sitting there. So what do you need? Well, you need messages, you need orders, you need communications, you need directions. So what do the Allies do? They create a whole set of radio messages which the Germans are allowed to listen to and the Germans are allowed to get hold of. Why? Because that fills in, with this fake radio traffic, that fills in the illusion that there is a real army there. What else? Well, you need a way of getting the fake army from England over to Calais. What do you need? You need landing craft. But you've only got a limited supply of landing craft because the landing craft are all further around the coast waiting to go to Normandy. So what do? Let's create some fake landing craft. And if we put those fake landing craft near to the fake army, then let the Germans see them, then what have you got? You've got an even stronger illusion that the Germans will be attacked in Calais itself. All of this is in support of that illusion or magic trick.
Alongside these radio broadcasts about the fake army and the inflatable tanks, before the invasion on the 6th of June, the RAF also dropped dummy parachutists to simulate an airborne invasion and draw German forces away from key objectives. But they also dropped metallic strips of paper, codenamed Window, all the way along the French coast to confuse German radar. To find out more about these metallic strips of paper, I have come to meet Valerie Fleming, who was alive during World War II and whose father was involved in its production.
My father's name was William Harry Milverton, and he was a machine minder or manager at a local printing company called Sun Engraving. During the Second World War, the printing factory was requisitioned by the government and had to print a range of things, including propaganda material like leaflets and newspapers, aerial reconnaissance guides and maps of France that helped pilots in the Normandy campaigns, and metallic strips of paper. The Air Ministry code-named these strips Window, and at the Sun Engraving they called it Mixture. Dropped in quantity from aircraft, the strips confused enemy radar systems. Both the Allied and the German powers came up with this at roughly the same time. On the Allied side, the inventor was Dr. R.V. Jones of the Department of Scientific Intelligence. However, a fundamental part of the plans for D-Day involved misleading the enemy into thinking that the Allied landings would take place in northeast France. Window made this deception plan possible, which my father helped to print. Lancaster bombers continuously dropped Window along the channel, causing the enemy's radar to pick up what appeared to be a massive seaborne convoy advancing on northern France. The Germans then prepared to counter what was in fact a bogus armada, while the Allies made their successful landings in Normandy. At home, my father used to do a lot of carpentry. He made lots of different things. In his toolbox, all his tools, he put his initials on, which was William Harry Milverton. So it's W-H-M. So whichever way you turned it, he knew they were his tools. He made lots of things like rocking parrots that open their eyes and beaks, and rocking horses and other children's toys to give at Christmas or birthdays. I also remember one day being in the garden in my pram, and my brother was playing beside me, when a V1 doodlebug came over the house. My mother rushed out into the garden, told my brother to go in under our iron table, and she tried to undo my strap, which was caught. So she laid over the top of me. Luckily, the doodlebug landed in a field very near the house and exploded, and nobody was hurt.
In addition to the deception methods we've already mentioned, the Allies were playing a game of cat and mouse, of intelligence and counterintelligence with the German enemy. You see, it was basically a war of spying, with the Germans believing that the information they were getting about the proposed invasion of Western Europe was correct. But you know what? It wasn't. What the Allies had managed to do, and in particular what the British had managed to do, was they'd managed to infiltrate most of the German networks. And they were basically feeding them back duff information. This information, of course, was telling the Germans that they could expect the invasion to come at Calais and not at Normandy. I suppose the most obvious and important example of this was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. He ran a network of imaginary double agents, all of whom were feeding back information to the Germans. The trouble was for the Germans that this information was completely and utterly duff. It was totally wrong. But that's not the point. The Germans believed it. And therefore, this was a very, very important factor in convincing the Germans that they could expect the invasion to be at Calais and not Normandy. And indeed explains why Hitler continued to believe that Calais was still going to be the likely point for an invasion of Western Europe, even after we'd landed on the 6th of June in Normandy itself. Obviously, the Ghost Army was hugely significant in the success of D-Day. If you look at where the German army was situated in June 1944 in Western Europe, they had 60 divisions in total, and yet only 18 were in Normandy, whilst further up there was 19 divisions in Belgium and northern France around the Calais area. So clearly the Germans, in preparing for an invasion, had bought the illusion that the Allies were going to land at Calais. The Allies landed on the 6th of June at about 6:30, and yet by lunchtime that day, Hitler was still not convinced that this was the real deal. Indeed, on the 29th of June, 23 days later, Hitler still refuses a suggestion to move the German 15th Army from Calais down to Normandy to fight the invaders. 23 days after the invasion has happened. Why is that? Very simply because Hitler still believes that Calais is the real deal, that is where the Allies are going to land. Why is that? Well, it's of course because Hitler has been fooled by the Ghost Army and by Operation Fortitude. So, yeah, hugely important, but at the same time, we have to accept that without Hitler and Hitler's control of the German army and Hitler's unwillingness and inability to listen to others, it would not have had the success that it did.
The Nazis overestimated the strength of Allied forces in Britain, particularly with the Ghost Army around the southeast coast of England. Even after the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944 in Normandy, they believed a larger second invasion would follow at Calais. These methods of deception and cleverly planned illusions contributed to the element of surprise and kept Nazi reinforcements away from Normandy. The deception strategy for D-Day was one of the most successful ever carried out.